Tiz, a vulnerable young Brazilian girl, finds herself speeding through the night towards the lights of a big city. Her companion is a man who has promised her parents that he will find their daughter work as a maid. What awaits her there is something different, however, and her life becomes increasingly fraught with danger, both mental and physical.
Interwoven into this tragic and violent storyline is the account of a young doctor whose life and love affair in the south of England are in stark contrast to the dangerous, sexually abusive situation in which Tiz finds herself. Yet their stories and that of their families become closely linked. You are listening to Tiz from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight by Deborah Vaughan.
Part 14. Traveller's Delight. Aidan, a young British trainee doctor, confesses to his young wife that he was forced to visit a brothel in Brazil when he was a teenager on holiday. He explains there is an opportunity to return to Brazil as part of his medical training and wants his wife and baby to go with him. It is his friend Yara, now with money and having escaped from her latest abuser, needs to catch a bus without being recognised to continue her journey to her home village. "I'd better hide somewhere," she decided when she arrived there panting. "Someone might see me and take me back." So she hunted anxiously around until she found a quiet place behind an old oil drum where she could keep an eye on the road. There she squatted down in the dust, her heart thumping nervously in her chest. As soon as she was sure nobody could see into her hidey hole, she retrieved the bundles of notes from her shirt to see how much money Guillaume had. She already knew what was in her own roll, but when her shaking fingers had counted the second, she was overjoyed to see how much she now had. "But," she whispered, "I earned it, so why shouldn't I have it?"
Quickly, she thrust the money back inside her shirt and curled herself into a small ball, keeping one eye on the road, which she could just glimpse round the edge of the barrel. She listened anxiously to every sound that drifted into her hiding place from the filling station. Feet pattered past, and voices floated over to her from groups of travellers who had begun to assemble to wait for the bus. Slowly, the minutes ticked by. When it came an hour later, she crept out from behind the oil drum, paid her fare to the stop nearest her home, and climbing excitedly aboard, took her seat.
Shrinking down below the window level, she did her best to remain invisible. But when the wheels slowly began to turn at last, and the bus made its way out of the filling station onto the highway, her heart began to sing. "With this money," she crowed triumphantly, "not only am I going home, but there will be enough to take Carlos back to Beleza. Hang on, little Tiz, help is on the way." Aidan was in the shower. The early morning sun was streaming in through the bathroom window of the small flat where he and Kirsty had been living now for over 2 years. He, however, had no eyes for the beauty of the morning, as he was watching a small black speck of dirt swirl round and round the plug hole, caught in a seemingly endless vortex of eddying water. As he watched, the fragment detached itself from its endless dance and slid smoothly down the drain. Aidan breathed a sigh.
"You've escaped," he said to himself. "It's not so easy for me, though. What am I going to do?" His thoughts went back for the umpteenth time to the previous day when he'd been looking idly at the notice board in the corridor outside one of the lecture rooms, and his eye had lighted on the small notice tucked away at the bottom. This had said that there was funding from a named charity for an 8-week elective in general medicine in Brazil. The position, the notice said, was on the team of Dr. Miguel Ramirez, who, it appeared, had worked at Aidan's hospital some years previously. Since all students were given the chance in their fourth year to study a particular area of interest within medicine, either at home or abroad for a short period, Aidan had been wondering where he would go. This was intended to be both a challenge and an opportunity to gain an insight into a different medical specialism. However, until now, he hadn't felt particularly drawn to any of the possible openings either overseas or at home. Neither had he spoken to Kirsty about his search, as he didn't want to worry her until he had made up his mind. However, what had made Aidan's heart lurch physically in his chest when he read the notice was that the placement was in Belize, where his Uncle Rhys had taken him when he'd been waiting for his A-level results.
Ever since yesterday, his mind had been churning with a complex mixture of thoughts and emotions. Should he go? Could he even bring himself to go back to a place which held so many dreadful memories? There was no doubt that in some strange way he couldn't quite understand, he felt drawn towards the post. But would Kirsty like the idea? She was bound to ask him why he wanted to go to that particular city, and he would obviously have to tell her what had happened there. What would she think of him then? She might also dislike the idea of leaving the UK. He'd never even spoken to her about the possibility of going abroad. And what about his mum and Kirsty's dad, who would hate it if they were so far away? All these thoughts, and many more like them, whirled round his head, clamouring for his attention, and worse still, for an immediate decision.
He got out of the shower and dried himself. He then began to brush his teeth, as he had done thousands of times before, looking in the mirror to check that he was doing it correctly. His anxious reflection gazed back at him, but he was so preoccupied that he failed to notice that his dark hair was standing up on end, and his mouth now sported a rakish white toothpaste moustache. The door opened and Kirsty, dressed in jeans and t-shirt, came in.
"I've just put the coffee on, Aidan," she said. "Are you nearly ready for breakfast?" Then she moved behind him and wound her arms round his neck, snuggling close to him, so that her unruffled image was now next to his own tousled one. In an instant he was transported back to that moment in the cathedral when her face, like a glowing, life-giving sun, had so warmed his heart in the huge horizontal viewing mirror. Then, softly, as a dim echo from another age, he heard again the words, "Comfort my world." Maybe, just maybe, this was his opportunity to do that.
As he quickly dragged on his clothes, Aidan thought frantically how he might broach the subject to Kirsty. He'd never, at any time, even hinted at his dreadful experiences with Rhys. The memories were still appallingly painful, and indeed the only person to hear his confession had been Father James. What on earth is she going to think about me? He agonized, running a comb briefly through his hair. I've just got to tell her now. Will she stop loving me? The idea was so dreadful that it made him feel quite dizzy. At least I'm not going to the hospital today, he thought with relief. I'm sure I couldn't concentrate on anything. Fortunately, both he and Kirsty had one of their rare days off together and had planned to go out for a day's walking.
As the car threaded its way out of the town towards the countryside, Aidan drove on autopilot, paying no attention to either Kirsty or the passing scenery. They'd decided to follow a track high up on the South Downs, and it wasn't until they were chugging up the steep winding road to the parking area that he suddenly noticed that they were nearly at their destination. He realised then that he had been completely absorbed with the tempestuous thoughts that were racing about in his head.
Kirsty, too, had her problems on the journey, since they'd borrowed their neighbour's little Westie, Joshy, to take with them. The dog was young and not used to car travel, so he'd spent the first part of the journey jumping about and barking. At last, in desperation, she held him firmly on her knee so that he could look out of the window. From this vantage point, he avidly watched the passing countryside, looking like a small, imperious field marshal inspecting his troops. Aidan was so absorbed in his own thoughts, however, that he barely noticed the commotion in the car, and only dimly registered the fact that he was glad the dog had stopped making a noise.
Eventually they pulled into a car park on top of the downs, facing a stunning view over miles of countryside spread out in a scenic panorama far below them. A patchwork of fields, woodlands and old churches snuggled close to huddled villages. Collecting their rucksacks from the boot and Josh's lead and bottle of water, they set off hand in hand along the path that led along the top of the escarpment.
The little dog was entranced by all the new exciting smells and scampered about excitedly like a small white furry investigating agent at the end of his retractable lead. He, at least, was sublimely happy. As they walked along, Kirsty tried to talk to Aidan, but he was still totally absorbed in working out what he should say to her. Indeed, he'd now convinced himself that when she heard his confession, she would want to leave him at once. This thought filled him with despair, so that he answered his wife's questions either with a grunt or silence. Usually he ambled contentedly along beside her while she chatted to him about the view, the flowers, or the cloud formations, listening with half his attention and letting her observations wash over him. But today her constant commentary began to irritate him. At length both walked along in complete silence while Joshy chased flies, ate rabbit's droppings like a gourmet sampling the best truffles, and greeted every passing dog with the enthusiasm usually reserved for celebrities.
By lunchtime they were several miles along the ridge and well ahead of any less energetic walkers. "I'm starving. Let's have lunch now, Aidan," Kirsty said firmly. "It's 1 o'clock and we've come miles. My feet are aching and I've got to sit down and rest."
Aidan visibly started, turned and looked back the way they'd come. "How did we get here?" he muttered.
"We walked," replied Kirsty sharply. "For goodness sake, Aidan, if you don't tell me what the matter is soon, I shall walk back on my own. Hiking with a cabbage will be more exciting."
"Let's eat our lunch first," replied Aidan miserably. "Then I'll tell you." Kirsty looked round for a good place to sit and spotted a sheltered hollow a little way down the hill. She then spread out their picnic on a small waterproof ground sheet they had brought with them, for it was October and the ground was damp. While she did this, Aidan gave Joshy some water and a couple of biscuits, and the dog then curled himself up into a little ball on the corner of the ground sheet and fell fast asleep. "It's all right for you, little guy," thought Aidan. "You haven't a care in the world. I'd gladly change places with you right now."
Lunch was a gloomy, silent meal. Aidan sat hunched beside Kirsty, trying to fix his attention on a distant church spire, which poked up out of a small grove of trees. But the nearer he got to the end of his sandwiches, the slower he ate, until he stopped eating altogether and just gazed with unseeing eyes at the view. He was dimly aware that Kirsty was fuming with exasperation, but just couldn't face the moment when he had to tell her what was on his mind. Finally, she gave up waiting for him to finish, and after she'd drunk the last dregs of coffee, she banged the mug down onto the ground sheet, and she said firmly, "Whatever is the matter with you, Aidan?"
"It's something that happened yesterday," and something that happened a long time ago," he replied slowly, not looking at her. He then told her about the advert for the elective. "I would like to go and work with Dr. Ramirez for a couple of months, Kirsty," he said quietly, fixing his gaze on the church spire once more. "How would you feel about it?" There was a long pause while Kirsty digested this information.
"I'd love to go," she said at length. "What an adventure. My parents never went abroad for holidays, so it would be exciting to go and live in an exotic place." And she squeezed his hand and laid her head against his shoulder. But Aidan was still totally unresponsive, and the hand lay in hers, still and impassive, the hand of a stranger. Kirsty sat up and looked closely at him. "What else is troubling you?" she asked gently. The question hung between them like a drop of water trembling on a cobweb. "You said something that happened long ago. Is that the real problem?"
"Yes," replied Aidan, falling silent, totally unable to think of a way to begin. At last, taking a deep breath, he told her the whole tale, haltingly and with many pauses, while the dogs snored contentedly and the beautiful view lay unheeded below them. When he'd finished, Kirsty sat very still. "Oh, no," he thought despairingly. "What is she thinking? What have I done?" And he leant forward, put his head in his hands, and groaned aloud. Silence. At last he glanced at her and saw that she was looking very angry. Aidan had never seen Kirsty so cross before, and was appalled at the effect of his confession. "Kirsty, I'm so sorry," he said quietly, twisting his fingers together in an agony of remorse. "Can you ever forgive me? Do you still want to go on living with me? I can see you're very angry, and I don't blame you. But oh, I can't live without you now." And he stared fixedly at his hands in despair, unable to meet her eyes.
"Silly man," replied Kirsty gently, putting her arm lovingly round his shoulders. "I'm not angry with you. I'm livid with your foul Uncle Reese. It wasn't your fault. He must have put something really powerful in your drink. No wonder you didn't want him to come to our wedding," she added. "What a dreadful experience." Then putting her other arm round him, she held him to her in a long hug that said more about her commitment to him than 1,000 words could have done. And Aidan, wrapped up in that embrace, felt her love dissolve all the anxiety of the last 24 hours.
Kirsty stopped hugging him at last, and he opened his eyes. Down below him, the little towns and hamlets on the plain stretched out as far as the eye could see, glowing in the autumn sunshine. Indeed, their tranquillity seemed to mirror the deep peace that had descended on his heart the moment his wife had folded him in her arms. "Kirsty, I love you so much," he said, twinkling at her. "Will you marry me?"
She chuckled. "No, I can't," she replied with mock seriousness. "I don't think my husband would like that." Aidan lay back on the ground sheet, laughing at their private joke, and pulled her down into his arms. This caused an elderly hiker on the ridge path above them to shake her head disapprovingly, and to think gloomy thoughts about the younger generation as she continued on her way. Oblivious to the consternation they had caused, they soon sat up again and gazed at the view, the perfect panorama below now mirroring their oneness.
Eventually, Aidan said regretfully, "I think we'd best be getting back to the car soon. We came a long way, and the afternoon's half over."
"Not yet, Aidan," replied Kirsty. "I've got some news for you, too." And she eased him down once more onto the ground sheet, looking like a person who is about to offer a precious gift.
"What is it, Kirsty? Is something the matter?" he said, suddenly concerned.
"Relax, sweetheart," replied Kirsty. "It's nothing awful, quite the reverse. You're going to be a father." Aidan rolled over onto his stomach and, propping himself up on his elbow, gazed down at her in amazement.
"Darling, how wonderful!" he breathed, placing his hand gently on her stomach, as if he could already feel the baby. "When did you find out?"
Kirsty told him, and then said with a twinkle in her eye, "And before you ask, it won't stop us going to Brazil. This obliging baby may not have been exactly planned, but will be here before we go."
The walk back to the car in the early afternoon sunshine couldn't have been more of a contrast to the morning. They laughed and joked, speculating on Aidan's chances of getting the post and what it would involve.
"Do you know any more details?" Kirsty questioned as they went hand in hand together along the path.
"Well, I do know that the hospital is an old one," he replied. "Their website said that it used to be run by nuns in the early days and is built in the grounds of their convent. They don't run it now," he added. "It's been taken over by the government, but I think they still have a pastoral and administrative role in its day-to-day work."
"Nuns," mused Kirsty thoughtfully. "I've never even spoken to one. I always think they look so odd in their funny clothes. I know my naughty dad calls them penguins," she added, chuckling. As they chatted happily together, the miles sped by, but this time Aidan knew it was because he was enjoying himself so much. He felt supremely happy. The air was invigorating, the view incomparable, and the dog, now rejuvenated by his rest, sniffed and scampered about, tangling his lead round their legs in unrelenting excitement.
Aidan also felt as if he was seeing Kirsty for the first time, and his love for her reached a deeper level than he would have thought possible. Transformed from being a frothy, exciting thing that made his heart race and his body thrill, this emotion was profound, solid, and immensely satisfying. That night, when they lay contentedly in each other's arms, Aidan reflected that the term making love was the wrong one. It ought to be expressing love, or showing love, or making love visible, as their very love-making seemed to have a depth and fulfilment to it that neither had before experienced. No longer did it seem just the coming together of two bodies in passing ecstasy, but the melding of two beings into one new, unified, whole body, mind, and spirit. Aidan and Kirsty sat waiting for their plane to Sao Paulo to take off, with Joy in a tiny bulkhead cot in front of them. The day so far had been an exhausting one, with an early start for the long drive to Heathrow. Both Stephen and Emily had come to see them off, so there had been much hugging, kissing, and surreptitious brushing away of rogue tears before they'd finally got to the departure lounge. Looking sideways at her husband, Kirsty saw that he was preoccupied and unhappy.
"I know what he's thinking," she thought. "He's remembering the last time he set off on this journey. As if divining her thoughts, Aidan turned to her, a worried expression on his face, and said miserably,
"I'm so glad it's you, darling, and not Reese sitting beside me."
"I guessed that's what you were thinking," replied Kirsty. "Don't worry," she continued with a reassuring smile. "You've got me now, and whatever's waiting for us in Brazil we'll face together." Aidan took her hand and squeezed it in his own.
"Thank you, darling," he said simply.
Very soon the plane took off. Joy cried as the cabin pressure changed, but quickly stopped once her ears had adjusted. She soon settled down for a nap in Kirsty's arms, who, overcome with tiredness, leant her head against Aidan's shoulder and closed her eyes. "We must look a bit like the Holy Family sculpture in the cathedral," she thought sleepily, with Aidan protecting us both like Joseph. "If only we had a manger, though. Joy would have more room in one of those." With that she drifted off to sleep, and so missed the hostess's sympathetic smile as she passed the little family, returning a little while later with a blanket to tuck round the three of them.
11 weary hours later they touched down in Sao Paulo and had to scramble to catch the plane for the next leg of their journey to the north of the country. This time it was Aidan who went to sleep, whilst Kirsty tried to comfort a fretful baby for the next 4 long hours. Eventually the plane touched down at Beleza, and the tedious process of disembarkation and baggage retrieval began. Waiting for their last case to come round the carousel, Kirsty, who was exhausted, began to feel that she was part of an unpleasant dream. The illusion was intensified by the babble of hundreds of voices, all talking a foreign language, which seemed to overwhelm her mind in a welter of alien sounds. The signs, too, were nearly all in Portuguese, so she couldn't understand them, and everything and everyone looked so different. To regain control of herself, she focused her attention on Aidan, who was inspecting each case as it came past him. Somehow just the sight of his long, thin figure, unruly black hair and serious face calmed her panic, and she began to feel a sense of reality return once more. Finally, the last of their bags began its slow trundle round the circle, and putting it on the trolley with the others, they began their walk to the arrival point.
"I do hope the convent hasn't forgotten we're coming today," remarked Kirsty fretfully. "What should we do if there's nobody there? They did promise to send a car, didn't they?"
"Calm down," replied Aidan, giving her a reassuring smile. "I'm sure they haven't forgotten." At that moment he spotted a short, stocky man holding up a sign which read, "Mr. Vickers." "I guess that's us, Kirsty," he said in a relieved tone, shepherding the three of them through the throng of arrivals to where the man was standing. "My name is Vickers," said Aidan, pointing to himself, "and this is my wife and baby." "I drive you to the convent," said the man simply, and led the way out of the airport building. At once the heat hit Kirsty, and she felt like running back inside into the cool of the air conditioning. Then she looked down at Joy asleep in the baby carrier on her chest. You have been listening to Tis from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight. You may find more information by searching the web for The Garden of Sparkling Delight.
Soaring to the skies with the wind in your hair, a safe place only you can hide, trusting in those to keep you safe from harm. No hope tomorrow, nowhere to run, wondering how your life could be so cruel. Just just like the others, so vulnerable. Surely in your dreams you would fly with an eagle, sheltered in his wings.